So what it is that actors do need to know how to do? They certainly need to know how to surrender to that emotion when it comes, because it will always come, because the circumstances will always evoke through the actor's imagination certain experience, not just emotional, but also physical, not just physical, but also emotional. However, what actors need to be taught, which is what Demidov is teaching them, and what you and I are teaching every day, is how to surrender to an emotion, how to yield to an emotion, how to green light that emotion. And with it, of course, character. And with it, of course, circumstances. Because those are completely inseparable. It's ultimately the same thing.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unlocking Creativity Conversations in the Demidov School. My name is Nolan Hennelly. I'm a teacher in training with the International Demidov Association, and I'm joined, as always, from Greece by Kimon Fioretos, who is another teacher in training and facilitator with the Demidov Association. And with us is Andrei Malaev-Babel, master teacher of the Demidov Association. And it's a pleasure to be with you both, as always. So let's get right down to it. Today, we are talking about the big one. We've had quite a few conversations about different topics, but this is the topic that I think, most people will be interested in when they're thinking about acting training. Today, we're talking about emotions. And to get us started, I'll share a little something about when I began training as an actor. Within the first couple of weeks of that training, I remember the conversation after someone's scene or another. After a simple question was asked about an emotion, the teacher said, "We won't talk about that. We won't talk about emotions. We don't need to today. We'll get to it later because emotions are just a byproduct of actions." I won't surprise anyone when I'll tell you we never ended up talking about emotions at all. And so I thought maybe we could start today by discussing this sort of, widely held belief that emotions are just a byproduct of actions. So I was wondering, maybe, Andrei, if you could start by responding to that thought.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I will first respond to something that is incredibly typical, and a lot of actors will recognize it, that you just shared with us. Your teacher saying, "Oh, no, 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 we don't speak about emotion," right? So there is that refusal, rejection, right? There is basically this forbidden theme, right? It is forbidden to speak about emotion. Where did it come from? It came from Stanislavski, of course. Everything comes from Stanislavski, doesn't it? Even some of these acting schools that say we are contradictory to Stanislavski, in fact, are based on the same fundamental principles as the so-called Stanislavski system known in America and outside of America as method. So what happened with Stanislavski? He knew, of course, and a lot of his mistakes come from certain pedagogical tactics. He knew very well that actors fixate on emotions, that actors highly value emotions, that actors constantly concentrate on emotions. But, gentlemen, how could they not? When you're thinking of an actor, you can imagine any kind of actor except emotionless. They're great actors, they're just emotionless. What? To share emotions, to reveal emotions, to express emotions, that's what it's all about. Dry actor, emotionless actor. Yes, absolutely. Every once in a while, you get some actor who is seemingly, right, completely emotionless, but underneath that, there better be a volcano going on, right? And then, of course, that still bleeds through apparently emotionless appearance, right? So Stanislavski knew that, and he created this dogma that we are forbidden to go to emotions, because otherwise actors will try to go for the emotion, hunt emotion, but because it's impossible to hunt them, because it's impossible to appeal to them directly, actors will end up playing emotion. And Stanislavski was obviously against it. So that's why he proclaimed that emotion is just a byproduct of action, because his system is action-based, and we don't speak about it. The idea is that as we engage in physical actions, and by the way, physical action is a psychological action, so it's really psychophysical action. It's interesting, right? Physical actions, physical actions, physical actions. What do you mean physical? How can physical be separated from psychological? Well, we really mean psychophysical action. Then why do we keep psychological out of it? Do you follow me? The same reason. The same reason. Appealing directly to emotion is a big no-no. So Stanislavski comes with physical actions and the method of physical actions, where everything is shifted towards what the actor is physically doing. Everything is translated into that language of physicality, of what the actor is physically doing, right? So that the actor never fixates directly on emotions. While every script of every author, including great author, is filled with stage directions, tenderly, joyfully, thoughtfully, ecstatically, grievously, and so on and so on and so on, right? So on one hand, you've got the playwrights who are directing us, conducting us emotionally as actors. On the other hand, we've got Stanislavski who says, don't go there, right? This is just a byproduct, go for the action. And we have Demidov, who simply brings the candle into this dark room, ultimately, and says, ladies and gentlemen, action is as much a byproduct of something else as emotion, which means that going for the action is not less harmful than going for the emotion, because both emotion and action and everything else is ultimately a byproduct of perception. That is the Demidov revolution. Because if you don't perceive something, why would you react to it emotionally? Or why would you react to it physically? Or why would you react to it at all? Ultimately, right? So that's the answer to this very, very characteristic scene that you evoked, Nolan, from your acting classroom.
Thank you, Andrei.
Thank you.
Andrei, can I ask? Actually, I want to bring something on the table, and it is that in many schools of thought, for instance, the Meisner school of thought, there is a point where they will bring something like emotional preparation, and Meisner defined emotional preparation as the device that's going to change the actor to be different from what he was 2 minutes ago. And one of his directions is, and that's for the first moment until something changes it, but you need to come in loaded in a sense. So in many Meisnerian, if you like, schools, what you'll find is people in a corridor usually trying to emotionally prepare. And Meisner actually says, well, whatever works, but the thing that I'm suggesting for you to use is daydreaming. And what he uses as a daydream is a seed of truth, something that is very valuable to you or emotionally loaded in a imaginary circumstance. So you might use somebody you love or something you feel very strongly about. Maybe it's aspirational.
Who you?
Please.
Character or actor?
Well, actor.
Aha.
And that's one of the issues. At the beginning, what you use is yourself. So you're using something imaginary because he keeps on saying it has to be imaginary. It needs to be imaginary. But at the end, it doesn't really differ from the idea of, well, I'm using something from my life into an imaginary circumstance. Yeah, it's imaginary, but it's my life.
Do you realize, Kimon, where it's coming from? That's another contradiction in Stanislavski that is resolved by Demidov. On one hand, don't go there. Don't appeal to emotion directly. It's a no-no. On the other hand, emotional recall or emotional memory. or sensory memory that is connected with emotional memory, because the idea behind sensory memory is still to evoke emotions. And Meisner simply runs along with that. That's all they do. They still proceed from Stanislavski, right? And so, look, on one end, don't go to the emotion. On the other end, emotional memory, emotional recall, sensory memory that is supposed to evoke emotions. Do you see how it is completely contradictory? As for what you are saying, unfortunately, you are not kidding. Because I personally spoke with the head of a school, theater school, that was rooted in Meisner. And he said, you should come and walk our corridors when we are working on emotional preparation. There is not a dry eye there. Everybody is sobbing. Everybody is hysterical. So apparently it's real. But sorry, Kimon, I got excited. What is your thought? Or what is your question?
No, my thought is that at some point, Lee Strasberg, for instance, as you said, with affective memory, emotional memory, sense memory, and Meisner with his device of daydreaming and emotional preparation, everybody's touching at some point at emotions, but it touch and go way, meaning it's like a patient on a bed and we're going to touch it and then go, because he says in his book, there is an imaginary student that says, so you're telling us it's something we need to know how to do, but you can't tell us how exactly. And he says, yes, because everybody has to get there, but well, I don't know how to get you there in a sense.
Of course, yeah. And he's not alone. Stanislavski did not know a lot. Bachangov speaks about unresolved issues of the Stanislavski system, right? So again, all of them resolved by Demidov. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And one of the things that is problematic, of course, and some of the teachers of acting, like Michael Chekhov, for example, who is somewhat close to Demidov, they knew it was problematic. Because for as long as it's about you, for as long as you are digging into your psyche, for as long as it is your emotions evoked by circumstances of your life, or perhaps imaginary circumstances, but still it's about you. Well, of course, the moment you find yourself in imaginary circumstances, gentlemen, you can no longer be you. At least for a second, you will transform. But because you don't know how to surrender to that character, you will not be able to, of course, stay in the results of the imaginary if that you mentioned, Kim, for longer than a couple of seconds. Imaginary if is a very powerful device. The problem is it lasts about 5 seconds. You all tried it, right? For 5 seconds, yes, you absolutely feel it. And then it fizzles immediately. So as a starter, as a jump starter, it's a great device, but then you need to know to do what is next. And nobody knows what to do next in order to actually capitalize on it and let it propel you, let's say, into a sea. So it's a very slippery slope. There are other reasons that people quote to appeal to actors' personal life and therefore personal emotions. For example, some acting teachers say, I'm very sorry, but if you're blocking it out of your system, and there are certain emotions and there are certain situations that we block out of our system, we don't block it, of course. There are psychological protective mechanisms in us that are erasing certain parts of our memory, right? That are actually making us shy away from certain experiences, right? They're preservation mechanism of sorts. And the idea is, well, you need to be able to face these demons. So let me take you back to your childhood. Let me help you relive this. My question is, are you a trained psychiatrist? That's my first question to these acting teachers. Are you a professionally trained psychiatrist? If you take an actor somewhere into their depth of their traumatic psyche, because we are talking about trauma here, do you know how to get them back out? It is completely irresponsible. Unless you're a trained psychiatrist, and better a good one, because just a trained one is not going to do it. Because you may have been trained, but you still don't know how to do it because you've not practiced it successfully. So that's my answer to those teachers who keep taking their students to these places from which sometimes it's not easy to return. So the idea is, of course, unless you can face it, unless you can go there, then when you have to face it as a character, when you need to go there as a character, how could you do it if you could not do it in your personal life? This is the biggest BS, pardon my French, that I heard of. Why? You know how many great actors actually stuttered in everyday life until they stepped onto the stage, where that stutter suddenly disappeared. Why? Because their character, you see, didn't stutter. Why would they? There is transformation. And when an actor transforms, they transform with their whole self. Therefore, it doesn't matter what it is that this actor can or cannot face in regards to their own life. If they're playing a brave, bold individual who is capable of facing and withstanding all these things, well, so can they. Why? Because they're doing it under the mask of the character, because they're doing it under the guise of the character. Therefore, they're doing it therapeutically safely. It's not me, it's someone else. It is me, and I'm confessing the deep and profound truths about myself. And I'm actually facing the deep and profound truths about myself. But because I do it all under the guise of someone else, I can do it fully. That is a completely different situation. So, gentlemen, what I'm saying there is that it is absolutely safe to practice emotions, but when you're practicing them in the transformed state as someone else, hidden behind the mask, these are still your emotions. But of course, you are doing it safely because you are now someone else. And it's a completely different thing, including completely different thing therapeutically. It is safe than facing your own emotions without character, without the mask, and going there. That is unsafe and can be very unsafe for some. And Demidov, being a professionally trained psychiatrist who did not only graduate from the Moscow University with that degree in psychiatry, one of the best schools, but also practiced it with some of the greatest practitioners of the time, of course, knows what he is doing when he is taking you into these places. Always transformed, always under the guise of the character, so that the emotional experience and the emotional outpour is completely safe.
You
Nolan,
reminded. Sorry.
yeah, I
Well,
thought, Nolan, you had something to say.
well, no, you're just making me think of, and I might misquote it now, but it's one of my, one of the thoughts I go back to a lot about acting is Oscar Wilde saying, "Give a man a mask, and he'll show you who he is."
Oscar Wilde knew art and knew creativity. You can trust him when he says something.
hmm And some of these schools, that kind of traumatic, acting coaching that you were talking about. I've seen some of this work, Andrei, and they don't believe in character.
They
No,
don't.
they
They don't
don't.
believe. And what I find so strange about it is they take students sometimes at the age of 18 when they're going to college or whatever. And these are students that have probably acted in high school, but more importantly, they pretended as children. And when they pretended as children, the transformation was complete, perfect, and beautiful.
Yeah.
And then they have to spend so much time teaching these young actors that character doesn't exist, and they're wasting time teaching something that the students in their heart know isn't right,
Right.
because they know they've transformed.
In our podcast on transformation,
Mm-hmm.
which is, of course, deeply connected with emotion, and we will talk about it. Why? I mean, we already started talking about it. You remember, I actually remembered how a colleague of mine, when we were talking about transformation in conversation with me, got really upset and yelled at me Obviously, I'm sure he regretted it later, right? But he yelled at me, Andrei, I'm very sorry, but I don't happen to believe in God. So for him, transformation basically was God's miracle, not a normal condition of the actor, but something equated to a miracle. So that's why what you are saying is happening. People basically deny transformation, and then they end up with a lot of problems impossible to resolve, including where the hell this emotion is going to come from. We have to dig for it, we have to prepare it in advance, we have to find triggers for it.
That's what I wanted to talk about, is these triggers, this toolbox you hear, especially in American acting. All these tools, this toolbox, it's really a series of different kind of manipulations, and they're all meant to dig at a kind of emotion. What I've found is that the emotion that these tools digging at usually come up with is an emotion that, at best, makes the audience respond like this.
Yeah,
They're
get me
witnessing
out of here.
something.
Get me out of here.
Yeah, and it feels, I've always called it kind of like, my own term, but like kind of shattered glass acting. You hear it and it's painful for a moment. It does not stay with you. And
No,
Mm.
and you know what
experience
that then translates into? It translates into all these acting teachers saying, you see, that's why emotion doesn't really belong to the stage, because every time you see it on stage, it's off-putting. Not realizing that what's off-putting is that this is not character's emotion. This is not actually transfigured creative emotion. This is that actor's personal emotion, which is why when you are actually witnessing this emotional striptease, all you want to do is to leave the room.
Mhm.
Why? Because the emotion doesn't fit the character, because that actor is not that character, right? Let's say that actor is a coward in everyday life and they're playing a hero. That hero might shed a tear, but it's going to be a completely different tear than this coward's tears. So that's what the audience is responding to. They're responding to the fact that something is rotten in the kingdom of Denmark, something is wrong, and they all come up with the same kind of realization that they take out of it. Emotions just don't belong. These emotions don't. Creative emotions, emotions in character do. But sorry, Kimon, now we interrupted you, I think, because you
No,
were...
no. I'm actually remembering how one of the very known teachers says, well, actors come to us and they think they're going to transform into something. And now I'm paraphrasing, but he very proudly says, but it's not about transforming. You're not changing to anything. It's you. It's about you. So that's what they train. That's what they talk about. It's
And it's
about.
correct, but it's about 50% of the truth. Because, of course, all truths in our line of work are dialectical, they are contradictory, right? So, absolutely, it will always be you under the guise of the character's mask.
Character. Exactly.
Yeah.
But he
But
dismisses transformation. I
he
mean,
dismisses the other 50% that when this character is embodied, when you find yourself actually under the mask of the character, you stop being you. You become, as Demidov beautifully put it, you and not you. So they're just erasing the not you part and leaving just you. And it doesn't matter if they're doing it for pedagogical reasons so that actors don't schmact, don't overact, right? They're confusing a lot of people. They're misleading a lot of people. They're acting irresponsibly, ultimately.
There are
So,
many schools that have been created during the last 25 years. I can name at least two that emotions, because there were such a mystery for actors and it became such a burden on how do I get there? How do I get there? That address emotion by itself as if there is nothing else, but that's what an actor needs to do. But again, they're just taking emotion out of the whole equation as a whole
yeah.
and pinpointing or targeting emotion in a sense.
So, in other words, as always, right, whatever strategies are being used, they are ultimately ending up as their complete opposites.
Mm-hmm.
Don't talk about emotion, don't mention emotion, don't concentrate on emotion, don't fixate on emotion, transforms into actors doing just that ultimately. Fixating on emotion, concentrating on emotion, actually trying to find emotion and separating emotion from everything else, while in fact it is an inseparable part of the whole spectrum, of the whole system of the actor's process that includes character, relationships, circumstances. What else is there actually but character, relationship, and circumstance? Stanislavski would say actions. Well, that's something you thought out. Michael Chekhov will say psychological gestures. Well, that's something you thought out, right? So character, circumstances, and relationships, they exhaust it all if you think about it. And to be completely precise, circumstances actually exhaust it all. Because character is also circumstances, because actually relationship is also circumstances. And by expanding it to these other, as you said, tools in the toolkit, like psychological gesture, like actions, right? You are basically just bringing in something completely unnecessary. And yes, absolutely, you can work correctly with the circumstances alone, and what will result on stage will be very active, and it will look like it was all achieved through the school of action and activity. But the fact is, it was not achieved through that school, just as that school did not exist until Stanislavski came up with it in the 20th century. And how many great actors never used Stanislavski and tools and achieved the kind of acting that made Stanislavski want to find out how they did it? Except we know for sure that's not how they did it. Comrade Stanislavski, or Mr. Stanislavski, based on whether this is before 1917 or after 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, right? So it is unfortunate what's going on, right? But let's be very honest in terms of where the emotion comes from. It comes from imaginary circumstances. The moment imaginary circumstances come into play, I'm no longer just me. I cannot be just me. Why? Because the circumstances are no longer just mine. So the moment circumstances are no longer just mine, it's no longer just me. I become someone else. And because these circumstances now do belong to me as someone else, as it happens in life, circumstances begin to evoke emotions. Not only emotions, mind you, reactions. So that's the way that it all happens. But in order for it all to happen, we still have to perceive these circumstances as our own. So the real question is, are we perceiving these circumstances as our own? Or are we perceiving it as someone else's? Which is how all of the table works and all of the analytical work is conducted all over the world. When actors sit down with the director to talk about it all at the start of the rehearsal process, they're talking about his circumstances. They're talking about her circumstances, her being character. They're talking about someone else. They're never actually assuming the character. They're never assuming the circumstances. They're never personalizing it. It's just a cerebral game in encountering circumstances. From whose standpoint, mind you? From my standpoint as an actor, because the character is certainly not there. But I am very sorry, my standpoint of an actor is one thing, the character's standpoint is something else. So that's why when actors, after all that table work, step onto the stage, they're emotionally empty. Why? Circumstances do not touch them. Why? Because these are someone else's circumstances. It's quite a vicious circle. And Demidov found a way out of it, of course, not only theoretically, but most importantly, practically, through practice, through his training, through his school. But we are still, unfortunately, in the Middle Ages when it comes to character, circumstances, and therefore emotions. And until all this picture is somehow reversed and people understand that what we are doing contradicts the basic science, because science did catch up with Demidov eventually, right? Yeah, because some of the contemporary psychiatrists and psychologists, we are talking about contemporary to Demidov, who are still taught at every reputable medical school or psychiatry, psychology school, and creative psychology as well. I'm talking about Vygotsky and Ukhtomsky. They were telling Demidov that he should hurry up and publish his works so that they could quote him, saying, "You're about 5 years ahead of science." Unfortunately, I think they were wrong. It wasn't 5 years. And even if he was 5 years ahead of science, he is still more than 100 years ahead of the science of acting that is trying to catch up. But all of these dogmas, most of them unfortunately coming from Demidov's collaborator Stanislavski, all of these dogmas are blocking the way of actors' instinct, of actors' talent, actors' organic, natural creativity.
Thank you for saying that, Andrei. Because I think so many actors disenfranchise themselves from that. You know, they learn, they start acting, they have some beautiful, pure, transformative experience. They experience this me but not me, and they go, how do I get more of that? And then someone comes along and says, we're going to teach you how to act even on a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
I say, well, hold on. I was really interested in what was happening on a good day,
Yeah.
because something beautiful was happening on a good day. And I really want to know, how do I advance that? And instead you get this series of tips and party tricks, and they're somehow disconnected for me from art and from a sense of my own soul in the art. And so you don't use them. And when I even talk to actors who are very successful or, booking constantly, and I ask, do you use any of these things? They go, maybe if I'm doing a toothpaste commercial, because the director wants me to smile more, and I'll think of some trick that I learned to get myself through it. But when they're on set for something that they care about, no, they don't seem to use these tricks, because they know there's something more satisfying, even if they can't articulate it or put it into words.
Amen. Yeah, that is exactly so. Because when actors go into this profession, and obviously actors go into this profession because they had an experience. Sometimes when they saw someone having that experience, of course, that was enough. But certainly for the most part, because as you, Nolan, mentioned, they had that experience. They want more of that. They want to find out how to make every day like that. They want the technique of inspiration. They don't want the technique of this is what you fall back onto if inspiration fails you, which you are right, is what is taught everywhere. But again, this is one of the fundamental principles of Stanislavski. When inspiration fails you, you need technique. And Demidov says, no, 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 no. You need the bulletproof technique of inspiration. So what it is that actors do need to know how to do, they certainly need to know how to surrender to that emotion when it comes, because it will always come. Because the circumstances will always evoke through the actor's imagination certain experience, not just emotional, but also physical, not just physical, but also emotional. However, what actors need to be taught, which is what Demidov is teaching them, and what you and I are teaching every day, is how to surrender to an emotion, how to yield to an emotion, how to green light that emotion. And with it, of course, character. And with it, of course, circumstances. Because those are completely inseparable. It's ultimately the same thing. So that's what needs to be taught. the Demidovian green lighting, surrendering, yielding to, giving into. And it's an art, because what do actors usually do? And what is it that Stanislavski was trying to avoid? When emotion comes, actors grab it. When emotion comes, actors try to hold on to it. They try to keep it because it's precious. They know it, they're right. And they know that they're about to lose it. And because they grab it, they hold on to it, they try to keep it. That's how they lose it, because emotion doesn't tolerate that. However, Demidov teaches you how to surrender to an emotion, how to actually green light that emotion, how to give in to it. And that's a completely different tactic. It's a hands-off tactic, if you follow me, not grab tactic. So that's what Stanislavski is trying to do, awkwardly, right, pedagogically, is to redirect the actor's attention from the emotion so that they don't continue grabbing, holding to it, trying to squeeze it out of themselves. And another thing, so that they don't try to strengthen it, right? So they are also trying to straighten it. Because emotion, of course, is a curve. It ebbs and flows. It goes up and then it goes down. But the moment it goes down, actors are so deadly afraid of losing it, they try to straighten it and propel it forward. Where usually? Toward the audience. And that's another sure way to kill an emotion. Surrendering to its trajectory, surrendering to its flow, to its ups and downs. That's an art that Demidov trains from the first day. And that is what we need to know how to do as actors. Instead of running away from emotion, hiding from emotion, saying, oh, no, 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 anything but emotion. We need to be able to surrender to the emotion. We need to be able to keep that emotion and actually strengthen it, but not by holding on to it, not by grabbing it, but by yielding to it. But it is a practice, it is a school, it is an exercise that actors should actually practice daily, because it's a crucial part of their process. And let's face it, in life, we don't do these things. We don't surrender to emotions. If anything, we try to stop them. Right? So, and then on stage, we are suddenly expected to do the opposite. And everything in our mechanism is revolting against it, because that's not what we are practicing. Those are not the automatisms that we are practicing in everyday life, right? So there is a solution. There is a school that effectively teaches it based on how we are actually wired as human beings. But that is the Demidov School. And it exists in history when Demidov taught it, because not only did actually the theater world try to stop Demidov from teaching it, but they successfully stopped his students from teaching it. Some of his last students I was actually fortunate to meet, and they said we were forbidden, and therefore we betrayed our teacher. And then, of course, when his students go away, basically, fortunately, some of his last students, like Margarita Laskina and Oleg Akulevich, do publish his heritage. Not complete, right, but enough, 4 volumes. And that's where it all begins in the early first century. And then through my efforts, it became something that now belongs to the English-speaking world and therefore to the international community. When I talk about my efforts, I don't actually mean just publishing it, because that's something that I did with Margarita Laskina, his final assistant and the publisher of his heritage. I'm talking about practically bringing it to the world, because not everyone apparently can just read the book and begin to even imagine how it's done practically, right? And so we are doing it, and Nolan, Kimon, you are doing it through the work of the association. And all of it is incredibly important, because actors will keep searching for that thing that initially brought them into the profession that was basically bitten out of them, right? Kind of smacked out of them by all of these completely counterintuitive approaches. And it will continue happening until somebody will look truth in the eyes in terms of how we are wired as human beings, and therefore how should we go about it as actors, as acrobats of heightened emotions, because that's our job.
Well, thank you so much, Andrei. Thank you so much, Kimon. What a wonderful way to end our conversation about emotion. In so many ways, it feels like we're just getting started, though, right? It feels like that's
actually.
the beginning of a whole conversation. But yeah, but a good place to start. To those of you who are listening, thank you so much for joining us. There's so much more information down below in the description of this video about where you can find out more about the Demidov School, how you can come and join us, and especially on a day like today, talking about emotion. For anyone who's listening and is curious and thinks, oh, it's too good to be true, come join us. Try it. And you will be so surprised and delighted by what you're capable of. And we look forward to meeting and seeing you. All right, everyone. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. See
Thank
you
you.
soon.